Welcome, everyone. You are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. The Last Dinosaur is the podcast where you can learn about the changing landscape of the maritime space while hearing from those that are leading the charge. Today's guest is Captain Pradeep Chawla. Captain Chawla has been in the maritime industry for 50 years. He was at sea before spending 30 years with Anglo Eastern, retiring from the position of Managing Director, Group QHSE and Training. He is the chairman of GlobalMET, which is the Maritime Seafarer Training and Education Association, and has more recently set up a digital training provider called MarinePALS. Captain Chawla, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Chris. Good to see you.
I think, looking at your great history and tradition within the maritime space, and then pivoting into something that is digital, is a real testament. I'd love to hear of your journey towards this point, because I think it's really fascinating. A lot of folks, when they hear we're going to launch a new product, a digital product, they think of somebody younger, not a lot of maritime industry experience, and they just have this idea because they've seen something or heard friends talk about it or did some research. You're taking a different approach, but before we get there, I'd love to hear your journey, because your journey is really, it's what building what you're doing.
Thank you. I'll give you a short summary of my career. And like they say, age is only a number. So let's put that aside for a little while. And yes, you can't change it, but you can still think young. So I started my career in 1974 as a deck cadet, like everybody does at the age of 18. Became one of the youngest captains in the fleet at the age 29 in command of a bulk carrier. Wrote a book in 1992 about safety at sea, which was in the language Hindi and Tagalog, translated into those two languages. And then I had a wonderful career at Anglo Eastern, looking after quality, health, safety, environment, training, and digitalization. Somewhere around the early 90s, when training was not a nice word in our industry because nobody wanted to invest in it, we started a set of training centers, the first one in Mumbai, and then expanded to New Delhi, Manila, Odessa, and Shenzhen. So we set up training centers. 2009, set up a Maritime college, which produces 480 cadets per year, which is more than the combined output of all colleges probably in the UK now. And all of those 480 joined Anglo Eastern Ship Management. On the safety side of things, I had a team of 52 internal ISM auditors reporting to me. And so I've read every audit report for over 600 ships for 30 years. Had the fortune or misfortune of learning from the incidents that have happened. So everything to do with ISM, safety, all of that was also part of my responsibilities. That's a short summary of what I was doing. I was in charge of what works and what doesn't work to reduce incidents in the fleet. And I would say that we had a success in reducing our injury rates, port state control performance, etc., continuously throughout the 30 years that I was there. Just around the end of my career, I was kind of seeing this change in the behavior of the youngsters. Nobody likes reading anymore. Most of the learning now is youngsters spend more time on YouTube than on looking at a nice maritime book. And if you send a P&I Club circular, most people would kind of put it aside because it's 4 pages long. And that's for, later on. So our social
3.5 pages too long, right?
Right. Social behavior has been modified by the advent of social media, WhatsApp, Instagram, etc. And the second thing is that by bringing the computer into the palm of our hand in mobile phones, we never let go of it. Yes, the productivity does increase, but it also creates a shorter span of attention. So these social behaviors that we cannot change prompted me to start looking at how do we make our young seafarers learn in the age where everything is coming to them like in short spurts. If you notice, the Euronews channel now does not have news in a long format. It's all in 30-second bursts. And it's more or less the same if you are a parent of let's say a child in the age group of anything between 12 and 30, you probably can see that they don't ever read a newspaper. They don't subscribe to one, and they don't like long editorials. They like their news in headlines on the Instagram rather than going to read the Wall Street Journal or any of the nicer newspapers which are, having more in-depth analysis. So somewhere around 2018, I was struggling with this and getting the youngsters to learn. And that's when I did a bit of research and came across 3 areas which the universities of the world and the educationists in universities were already looking at. There is micro-learning, with the idea that all learning should be in bits and pieces, bite-sized learning. And then the second one that I was looking everywhere was gamification of learning. Role play, universities were giving the students learning about finance, imaginary set of stocks, and then making them play a game about, what would be your portfolio with the decisions that you took, which was learning, but it was gamification of learning. It was getting popular in the universities. And the third area which really impressed me was virtual reality. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg was all over the place with, Meta is going to change the world, etc. So after a lot of research, I came to the conclusion that these 3 would be the future pillars of learning, together with simulators, the big maritime simulators that we have been using since, I would say, in Anglo Eastern, we bought the first one in 1995. So ship handling simulators, engine room simulators, cargo handling simulators, welding simulators, there are, painting simulators, all kinds of simulators available. And that, I think, is a nice way also to learn, because you're transported into that environment with a bridge mock-up or an engine room mock-up. Similarly, in virtual reality, by putting them in that immersive glasses, you're transporting that person onto the environments of a ship or into a tank. The first one that we did was walking around in the four-peak tank, which as a cadet you don't really do till you actually come on a ship. And the first time that the chief officer takes you down, it is a scary experience for the cadet. So having done it in virtual reality takes away a little bit of that fear. So that's when the idea of my digital learning platform started. I think Anglo Eastern was the first private company to buy a ship handling simulator in 1995, which was only the big maritime colleges used to have that earlier. I believed in it at that time. I still believe that that's a strong tool for when we talk about creating competency of a seafarer. We all know that it is knowledge, skill, and attitude. Now, it's the knowledge part which we concentrate on most of the time. And in the past, everything has been about learning and spewing it out in an examination on paper. That
in 2.5 hours.
In 2.5 hours.
Or whatever. Yeah.
So, yeah. And so that kind of changed when we introduced simulators. So we could kind of do a bit more of skill training. I still remember this case where we had a very senior master who was given the task of taking a loaded Cape-sized bulk carrier into Rotterdam port. And there's a sharp turn in the EMO terminal coming into Rotterdam and to the coal terminal. And he collided with the breakwater. He was so upset that we repeated that exercise, I think maybe 7 or 8 times. But he got it right and he said, I have never had this experience. I've never had a collision or an elision in my career. But this is an amazing tool. And this was one of the senior most captains in the company. So that kind of spread like wildfire. Well, it doesn't go as fast as like today on WhatsApp groups, but it went into the fleet and we had a lot of fun with the youngsters wanting to say, I want to come and get trained on the simulator.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's like a viral moment back in the time there.
Yeah.
A lot of this is, I wrote down a few things. I love your 3 major points of micro-learning, gamification, and VR, and then by extension simulation, which I remember as they started to introduce that. I graduated from one of the maritime schools here in the U.S., SUNY Maritime, and they had one of the early bridge simulators right around the time I graduated in 1994. And I believe they started with their bridge simulator, I want to say after I left, like within the 3 years. So very similar to this time that Anglo Eastern had their simulators. I know they always had an engine room simulator, like, some diesel, and they would put an open can of diesel like on the side to make it smell like a diesel room, which was kind of, or some lubes or something. Again, I don't want to get, my school in trouble for OSHA violations, but they try to make it smell like a real engine room. And I think, that was the early days of almost a VR or gamification. I remember taking some of my exams. We had to do the lifeboat test before you went on your final cruise at the school. And it was just a small, like maybe 1/8 size lifeboat. And you had to do everything. And this was an open lifeboat, everything in the right step. Yeah, I could see it in my head, but forgot what they were called. But that was a little bit of gamification and simulation as well, because you had to do the steps the right way on a real piece of material. Granted, it was 1/8 or 1/16 the size of an actual lifeboat. So that certainly has been something that's been done in the maritime space. And certainly as you go into the digital side of things, I mean, you're really tackling at the heart of today's students and the way that they are consuming and learning, and talk about what your approach is and some of the feedback that you've been getting as you've been working with people.
Yeah. So, I mean, one has to always remember that in a classroom, if you remember that Ebbinghaus curve, I think it's called, we basically forget everything after 20 days, most of what we have been learning in a classroom. So with these 3 pillars, we are also, again, every educationist kind of says this cliche that what you do, you remember. And you just kind of recounted how you remembered the lifeboat one because you did that actually. So that's what we also try to bring into the virtual reality training, that you're actually doing things so that your brain kind of registers that better than just listening to someone boring in the class. So what kind of feedback for the VR? The general word that the youngsters use is awesome. The minute they come out of that classroom, they say, that was awesome. We actually did an experiment somewhere around 2019 where we had a lecture on mooring safety, which is a critical area in our lives. And people were kind of dozing off in that. And we actually had a video recording of students kind of losing interest. We repeated the same lecture, but in an online classroom with the next batch of students. And everybody was excited and they remembered a lot more because now they were looking like technology was being used, and they thought that, wow, we are in a college where there is modern technology. Exactly the same slides, right? Exactly the same material. So technology has also got this thing about, it's got an effect that youngsters like the idea that they're learning in new ways. We're still teaching them the same thing. How to anchor is not going to change, until we design a different...
Probably the same when I learned it, and probably the same when you learned it as well. I mean, maybe some of the stuff is different, probably a little more safer, but it's basically the same thing.
Yeah. So the experience with the 7-minute video format, so we basically do 2 types of formats, 7 minutes and less than a minute. The 7-minute one is kind of the more 5 to 7 minutes. So that's based on research from YouTube, and if you Google about it, they will say 2 to 5 minutes is an ideal size for a bite-sized learning nugget. With our experiments with seafarers, we have seen that you could stretch it to about 7 minutes. And this is based on, so we have 32,000 seafarers on our platform right now. And there have been kind of, I don't know exact number, but it's in hundreds of thousands of views over the 450 titles that we have. And we keep taking feedback from the seafarers, and generally it's, that 7-minute thing is what we stuck on to. And the less than 1 minute one is for reminders because of the youngsters' love for YouTube shorts and Instagram reels. They love it. So you can see them kind of flipping their fingers over that. Now in those ones, the trick is to engage them in the first 10 seconds. So you need to always be cognizant of the fact that they will lose interest even in 10 seconds if the opening is not right. And there is YouTube research also I mean, youngsters don't search in Google anymore. They search on YouTube. It's
on
30,
YouTube, yeah.
Yeah, it's 30 billion views a month now it's getting. So I just don't see the youngsters ever going on Google to search. And in a way, it's right, because in Google also the first few pages are generally sponsored. So they have realized that. And very few of them, there is research to show that most of them will not go beyond page 2 generally on Google. So whatever fits into the screen, the first 2 screens, and then they just give up on it. So one of the things is, how do we bring knowledge to their attention when needed and quickly? So that's our app for the mobile phone as well as for the web app, was designed with that fact in mind, that we need to give them learning content when they need it in a short format. So if they are going to do, let's say, tank cleaning tomorrow, and then if they want to kind of relook at some of the precautions for entering a tank, they could do it now quickly on their mobile phone app. In the past, if you expected someone to go back and read the company procedures in a big fat manual, well, not realistic to expect that to happen. But we are seeing evidence that now they are quite happy. So we have a little thingy in our app to mark your favorites. So each student can kind of see that, okay, I like this video. If I need it, I can come back to it. And so they mark it as a favorite. And so that kind of repeats the learning on their own willingness. Nobody's forcing them to see it again. But we have evidence that they have seen some of the videos 2 and 3 times, because they kind of want to revise it when they are actually doing that task.
To use your earlier example, maybe they were in a tank on another ship, on a 4P tank or a bunker tank for some repairs, and they went through it and they looked at it, and then, lo and behold, a year later they have to go back in, and it's like, okay, well, I did this, but, there's nuances, and you're dealing with your own life, and I'm like, okay, let's take a better look at this so that we could make sure we're okay. You go back to that YouTube thing and the shorts. I know some podcasters, including me, and I'm kind of joking around, like, that's how I've learned to kind of improve what I do, just in this, sitting on my butt podcasting, right? Like, how do I make it better? How do we, and I'm going to keep this in here, but you'll see one of the things I like to do is take a short, less than 60 seconds on the best part of what we're going to talk about. There's so much material even already, and I'm excited. But it's one of those things that I've just learned how to use. And it's not just the, let's say the Gen Alpha, generation coming through now, but it's folks in the later generations. I'll just leave it that way, Captain. One of the things that, we talk about the general safety, we talk about all these sort of things, and it sounds very interesting. And it is interesting because I think, one of the problems, and I'm sure you can confront it, is the whole idea that there's not enough seafarers. You're hearing these numbers that we're going to have a seafarer shortage. I know we look at it here in the U.S., but putting on wider view, this is a global thing. And there's kind of 2 major fronts that people are very concerned about with the training. One is alternative fuel, whether that's LNG, ammonia, methane, or something else. And then the other front is implications and implementation of, regulations that have to deal with the environment, especially around like slow steaming in port and other zones where you need to sometimes have the power not to go fast, but to get out of a situation or make a turn in a normal turn. I'd really like to hear kind of how you're addressing some of this on the digital side and then the training side, because I think it's going to be and it is an important part, not only retention, but then safety going forward.
Yeah. So one of the first VR programs that we made was actually for LNG bunkering. So the problem here was it was a Ro-Ro ship, and they've never really handled any kind of gas, and they were going to go to a dual fuel LNG engine. So we recreated the bunkering station and the fuel gas supply system room in virtual reality so that every seafarer, before they went on board, now these are regular Ro-Ro ship crew, right? But how to convert them and take away that fear that was there about LNG as a fuel. We did these things in virtual reality as well as 2D videos, and by giving them that absolute realistic walk through that area and explaining it we were able to kind of get a better acceptance, and, we took away the fear by introducing it in a classroom environment. Here are your glasses. You're going to wear these and you're going to be looking at what you're going to see when you get to the ship. So it was a very powerful tool to introduce dual fuel training to seafarers who had never dealt anything to do with LNG. So that's a success story that we had. And see, the challenge here is that the seafarer could be on a LNG engine this time. The next ship could be on methanol, and give it another year. The first engines for ammonia are coming out in the middle of 2025, somewhere in a few months or end of maybe early 2026. We'll have the first ammonia engines. And then there is going to be that the same chief engineer who just managed to finish learning about LNG is now going to go. And in between, he could have been going on a conventional diesel engine also. So that challenge.
And who knows? And then the who knows. And the other part is, and I'm really curious about this, is these hard rotor sails that are on ships.
Yes.
Again, it's not a bunkering issue, but it's just it's another piece of equipment. It's like a crane, or there's not going to be this sort of connectivity and stuff, but some safety around that, how it changes the handling of ships, if anything. And I had somebody on from one of the wind companies like this, and it sounded very positive, but at the same time, that was a small scale thing. I know this particular company just signed a deal with Maersk Tankers to put, I think, on 6 or 7 ships. This is Bound for Blue. They're hard rotor sails, and that's just another one too that they're going to have another piece of equipment to maintain, or at least to report any problems for the maintenance people to come in, because this is all new stuff.
It is, absolutely. But luckily, the rotor sail concept of 3 or 4 companies that are doing the flattener rotors, the good part there is the safety issues are not much out there. I mean, so the safety issues are a lot more on the dual fuels like LNG and ammonia. They are going to be designed out by good engineering controls. The controls for engineering are extremely strict. For example, on ammonia for the toxicity. I mean, basic principle is that the human being and the ammonia are never going to be in the same space ever. That's the whole design concept of it. So yes, the fact is that these things will keep coming up, the new ones, and everybody's still, looking at hydrogen engines also. So luckily for me, with the big fleet of Anglo Eastern, I've had experience of LNG as a fuel, and also the rotor sails. We had them on 3 of the ships, and we have ammonia coming up. The ships were designed for ammonia, a whole bunch of 40 ships coming in. So it was evident that the seafarer's life in the future is going to be changed faster than ever before. The pace of change is unprecedented. So it's not only about alternate fuels. They are also having to learn about digitalization. So we had this product called Wärtsilä Foss, and the passage planning is now automated. I mean, there is no more second mate sitting down and drawing courses. You put in port A.
My favorite part of being a second mate was doing the coursework and we go here, we're going to go here. We used to go around the Gulf.
Yeah, what took you 12 to 20 hours is going to take someone today on these automated routing systems literally 2 hours. So it's taking away a bit of the fun, but it's also, of course, making it safer.
Right. It is taking away a little bit of fun and a little bit of the skill in what you said. And I really would love to hear a little bit more, not only the digitalization side, but the other part, which is a big question mark. And as more and more ships become connected with connectivity, is the social media side and being connected. There is a lot of thought, and I haven't read a lot of, let's say, papers on it, but you hear more kind of stories about more and more companies, not shipping companies per se, but more companies like it when their own people have a social media presence because it boosts their presence. Shipping has always kind of lived in the shadows, right? And the only time that you hear about shipping is when there's a ship sideways on the Suez Canal, or unfortunately, a ship hits the bridge in Baltimore, right? That's the only time you hear about shipping. You don't hear about shipping when you go to the grocery stores and groceries are there. So how do you think in this age where social media is a big part of the kids, and then they become young adults in their life, how can social media be used to the positive to put a better light in not only the shipping industry, but shipping as a career?
I think on the education side, that's exactly what we are trying to do with our shorts, 1-minute videos. But every company today needs to have a pretty serious social media policy. And involving the seafarers through the social media channels certainly improves retention because they feel part of the growth of the company. I mean, I remember when we introduced taking the videos of our seafarers and putting them out on our social media channel in Anglo Eastern, we went from something like 20,000 followers to over 100,000 followers, because now the seafarers were actually seeing their own handiwork of a nice sunset, of birds flying over, dolphins on the ship side, following them, whatever. It created that sense of comradeship that I can contribute something that is good for the entire fleet. And there were also user stories about experiences in certain ports about what they went through. Well, that wasn't put on the social media, but internally it would be distributed then quite as a learning tool, because that is what someone faced in an African port, for example,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
The only part where social media presence needs to be thought of is when there is an emergency. And at that time, the seafarers generally need to be made aware of that this, if it's going to be a legal case, you shouldn't be putting, because you could be incriminating yourselves with it. So don't go, take care of the ship. Don't go around trying to film every little part like a, civilian reporter for CNN. And anyway,
exactly.
Yeah. So that's the only place where one needs to have a little bit of education within the company about the role of social media.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think you don't want to be restrictive to the point of being like 1984 overlord. You can't do anything. But at the same time, and I think that if you work with the company, sure, right, you're not going to take a picture of every single thing that you do in the office, because there could be proprietary information, just even hanging on a whiteboard someplace. I remember when I was a broker, we used to go to one major shipping company, oil company. And when the brokers would come in, they had a whiteboard. They would hang a sheet over the whiteboard.
Yeah.
It was, the whiteboard had their cargo schedule for the next 4 to 6 weeks, and they hung a sheet over it. And it was one of those things. Now, this was way before cameras or anything else, but just even like somebody just looking over and go, oh, he's going to have 3 cargoes this month. I should start pushing more ships because it's usually 1, right? And or at least you think it's 1. So I think that it's just a little bit of that kind of balancing and documenting those sort of policies, quote unquote, common sense, with giving people the ability of like, oh, we shared a nice meal for Diwali or for Christmas, right? Like you want to have that, because then you take the fear out of people of this what's perceived and is and can be a lonely existence, half a globe away, in some cases, away from your family, 3 to 6 months, and those sort of things. And I think that that's super important for the industry to address. As on that vein, and as we start to get close to wrapping up, I love to ask this question, especially from someone like you. And I'm like you, by the way. I may be a little older, but I don't feel it. Now, I'm slightly less experienced, so I'm of the Generation X, and there's a lot of things on Instagram and other places that say Generation X, when we were 10 and 15, we were 30. When we were 30, we were 30. And now when we're older than that, we still feel 30. So I've been kind of 30 for probably 40 years now. So saying that.
Well, that's my tagline, Chris. That's my tagline. I'm a 28-year-old in a slightly older body.
That's how I feel. My wife's like, don't do that. You're too old. I'm like, what are you talking about, too old? Although my son wants to go skiing, and I'm not a great skier. I used to ski a little bit. He's like, Dad, I want to go skiing. I'm like, yeah, I may go cross-country skiing or snowshoeing. I can't see myself falling down and I'm okay. But if I slip, like the bad shoulder comes back in play. But that's besides the point. But looking at, when you talk to younger folks thinking about a career in maritime, and whether that's a career that's at sea or shore, what do you tell them, and why should they come in the pool, as they say, and join us here in the shipping and maritime space?
Okay, so since I used to look after the recruitment of those cadets, what generally works is to find the people who are genuinely interested in bearing more responsibility. It's not so obvious. Most of the people who kind of say, oh, you're going to get great wages or you're going to see the world. No. What really attracts the seafarers is that, especially the younger ones of the generation today, is that at the age of 22, you're going to be in charge of a $200 million asset carrying a cargo of $200 million, and you're going to be on watch alone in the daytime and with one other person in the nighttime, and that $400 million asset is in your control. Now look at that. See how many years would it take you to become a CEO, and to even then, for anything over X dollars, depending upon size of the company, you would still have to get the board approval for that. But the seafaring place is the only place where master is literally in charge of that asset without any interference from anybody, and under law, under ISM, has the complete power with respect to safety on his ship without having to ask anybody. Now that kind of thing really appeals to the young people to say, wow, that's a great profession. And another one that I would always show them is, well, if you like engines, what's your favorite? This car, that car, this motorcycle, whatever. I said, have a look at now this container ship engine room, which is kind of 8 floors tall. Would you not want to be working on this engine instead of that little Ducati bike that you were so proud about, or, Harley Davidson or whatever? And why not play with the engine, which is, so much bigger? And that attracts the people who are inclined towards the engine room. And the ships really today are so nice in terms of accommodation quality. There are no shared toilets anymore. We have laws under MLC for, including how long is the mattress allowed to be used. So, right. So, it's not a tough life. Yes, what matters to certain countries where we are unable to attract seafarers, say like the US or OECD countries, that's because the differential in wage to let go of your social life is no longer sufficient. So if you were to plot the wages of a seafarer in US compared to someone, let's say, working for Google or Facebook or for Elon Musk, then you would see that that differential that was there in the 1960s and 70s between a captain and a person working ashore was quite high. We paid in the industry for the social things that we were missing. That differential is becoming smaller. And then there is this banking industry and IT industry who seem to kind of give the dreams that everybody is going to become a Bill Gates or a Mark Zuckerberg. So in the advanced countries where job opportunities are a lot more available, we are losing some of the youngsters. But that's not really the problem worldwide. In places like India, Philippines, we're still going to find seafarers even in the next 50 years. So it's always related to the economics of that particular country at that particular time. You can still attract people who like the adventure of the sea. Greece is still very successful in bringing seafarers, and so is Norway. So it's not a lost case, actually. We will never run out of seafarers. We may have them looking different from our neighbors, maybe, but the sea is still going to attract the brave people.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing I think, I know on the U.S. end, certainly one of the things that was always a consideration when you went to sea, and especially if you started sailing master and chief mate, especially chief mates in the U.S. flag, because they were allowed to do overtime, typically made more than captains, but it was the overtime, not the. But anyway, when you came ashore, it was like you always had to take a significant step down. And now, especially as needs are different and there's a different focus on things, and It's not just one type of job. Like, if you were a captain, you came in as a port captain or a superintendent, and you were moved out here. Now you come in as a captain and you could be moved into a VP role or EVP role of something else. So it's a very different, structure to go from one to another. And my final question I'd love to ask, and you're a well-traveled person, what are you reading these days besides at one point reading 600 safety audits, which I don't know if anybody would want to do that, but what are you reading these days?
Okay, for this week, it's going to be the HTW papers in IMO because the STCW revisions are going on and the meeting is next week, which I will be attending. But I am more kind of, and also even though we are older, I still like to watch more news than other forms of entertainment. And right now there is, I don't know whether to call it entertainment or shock and awe with whatever is happening in the world events right now in the last, let's say even in the last 48 hours, the Panama, the Greenland and the Gaza and whatever else, and its effect. What I do also like to read is what is the effect of all this going to be on the trade routes? How is it going to affect the life of the seafarers in it and the shipping companies? So that's interesting to read. On the lighter side, I like to take things which are, more documentary kind of things, biopics and stuff like that. I've gone past the stage of reading fiction because right now, even the news is fiction half the time. It's fake news or real news. In the world of social media, that's our biggest problem to teach our children is how do you differentiate what is real and what is made up, So, I think world events are always kind of very engaging for me to keep trying to understand and to prepare the youngsters for that. I mean, our role as senior people is to be able to guide the ones who are not yet experienced enough. So, I mean, if you are a 20-year-old today in the US and you had not seen the first Trump presidency, you would probably get worried about it. But, for people who've gone through that one, say, yeah, okay, this will settle, this will happen, So it's the role of, so I do a lot of mentoring for the youngsters in the industry. And quite often it's more about getting them to calm down and say, hey, the world will go around, don't worry.
Yeah. Well, I may have to call you on that once in a while as well. Speaking of going back to your topic of especially doing things in kind of digital shorts and stuff, I'm reading a great book called Smart Brevity, and it talks about writing. It's from the folks, I think it's Axios and maybe Politico. They write in like this smart way, and it's meant to grab attention. And I find it as I go through and I put things on social media. I actually I worked on it a couple of nights ago, and it's going to post sometime soon. And it talks about like using things like why it matters and taking a long sentence and just down to like the absolute minimum. And I'm going to try doing this. And, I think it's one of the great things about social media is that you could practice a lot, right? Like you could practice and then you could bring that into your professional life and say, hey, I'm practice over here where sometimes not everybody watches you, right? But you're on this, and then I could bring it into my professional life, and then I use this type of cadence and thing. And it would be very good, Capt. Chawla, because I think if you look at it, it builds on what you were talking about, right? Talking about like short, succinct. You talked about the 10 seconds. Like this is what they make that same exact point. And I learned that years ago. I worked for a company that was owned by private equity. And I used to write a weekly report that we would tool it internally, then send it to the people at private equity. And I remember one of the great lessons that I learned there was not about money, it was not about the market. It was with the private equity folks and with other folks, you have one or two sentences to make your point.
Yeah, absolutely. There. I have never come across a CEO who could read more than 4 lines without losing attention.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, and that I learned that over 10 years ago. And I remember someone saying, "No, you got to make the point in the first couple of sentences, and if they want to read it, then they'll read it. But if you don't capture them and make kind of give them the high level, like markets are going up, And because there's just, there's not a lot of supply left and demand remains robust. Boom, boom. Okay, they'll read why. It's because there's two ships in dry dock, or they went on long voyages and blah, blah, blah. Right? Like all these things. And it's interesting because it's something that they don't teach you in school, but you have to learn. And the faster you can learn that, it definitely helps your career.
Yeah, first paragraph needs to have the hook for someone to be interested in reading further. What's also occupying my life now is to try and understand this generative AI, because I'm trying to use that in not only for my product, but also for in general to be able to do more things and, improve productivity for various things that we can in shipping with using generative AI. And so I'm reading
it's
books on it.
Yeah. It's fabulous. I'm trying to learn a little bit as well, and maybe not generative, but just maybe how to use it more, as a tool. And again, not to take over the world, but just to make your life better and make my life better, and kind of do my, whether it's my podcast or my job, or even sometimes notes to, my wife and I will work on a note that we're sending to somebody, and she's like, "Oh man, it's through ChatGPT." Yeah, cool. Like, she's like, "I prompted this way." I'm like, "Oh, that's really great," or I'll send her an email like, "What do you think of this?" She goes, "That's great." She goes, "You didn't write that, did you?" Like, "Well, I wrote some of it."
Yeah, I'm sure you would be using a tool to transcribe and summarize the whole recording, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yep. We're going to be using a tool to help me do all this stuff. It just allows me to put out the volume. I still control it. I still edit it by hand in a way. But yeah, a lot of the other tools that just weren't around or weren't as easy accessible even when I started 3 years ago, because I'm coming up on year number 3. Absolutely. Well, Captain, this was a fabulous journey. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. And good luck to all your listeners, and good luck with your podcast to reach 1 million more people.
Yeah, I hope so. I'll settle for 10,000 or 100,000 at this point. Thank you so much, Captain.
There's got to be a start, so I'm sure you'll reach there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.